No one talks about how he was erased, not because of his voice, but because of his face. Doug Parkinson, the man once hailed as the most powerful soul voice in Australia, was quietly pushed aside by an industry that couldn't sell what he looked like. While his vocals could rival any international legend, Parkinson never became the household name he deserved to be. Not because he lacked talent, but because he didn't fit the mold. Before his death in 2021, Parkinson had already been forgotten by many, a haunting injustice for someone who once topped charts, filled concert halls, and moved audiences to tears. But behind every soulful growl and bluesy riff was a man who knew. In show business, voice is second to looks. He spoke of it rarely, but when he did, the pain was there. Not loud, not angry, just quiet, bitter truth. This story isn't about another washed-up singer. It's about how the entertainment industry discards its most unique voices when they don't come in a marketable package. It's about Doug Parkinson, the man with a voice that could break hearts and an appearance that broke his career. In this video, we'll uncover the secret prejudice that followed Parkinson for decades. We'll look at the hit songs, the critical acclaim, the unrealized potential. But more than anything, we'll pull back the curtain on the brutal honesty of what it means to be too talented and not pretty enough. Doug Parkinson was born in 1946 in the small coastal town of Newcastle, New South Wales, a place far removed from the glitz of show business, but rich with working-class grit and soul. As a teenager, he discovered American soul and R&B records that would shape his musical identity for life. While most Australian acts in the 60s were chasing surf rock or pop, Parkinson immersed himself in the deep, gravelly power of Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, and Ray Charles. By the mid-1960s, he had formed Doug Parkinson and Focus, a band that would soon deliver one of the most iconic covers in Australian music history, the Beatles' Dear Prudence. Released in 1969, his version wasn't just a hit, it was a revelation. The song climbed to number 5 on the Australian charts and became a defining anthem of its time. Critics called it soulful, raw, and ahead of its time. Doug's voice wasn't just good, it was unforgettable. A deep, soulful baritone with texture and emotion that no one else on the scene could match. And yet, as the 1970s rolled in, something strange began to happen. While many of his contemporaries, some less vocally gifted, were being scooped up by major labels, appearing regularly on television, and landing international deals, Doug's career never reached the heights it deserved. It wasn't about the music. He was consistently praised for his live performances, often stealing the show. It wasn't about the work ethic. He toured relentlessly. The whispers within the industry were quiet but cruel. He was too big, too hairy, too intense. His look didn't fit the market. The Australian entertainment industry of the 70s and 80s, much like elsewhere in the world, was becoming increasingly focused on image. Acts with commercial appeal, clean-cut faces, fashion-friendly aesthetics were prioritized. Record labels weren't just selling sound anymore, they were selling fantasy. And Doug Parkinson, with his imposing figure, brooding presence, and unfiltered vocal style, was not the fantasy they were looking for. He did not conform to the pop archetype. He wasn't a teen idol. He wasn't glamorous. He didn't play the fame game. And in an era when TV appearances could make or break a career, Doug was often kept in the shadows, invited to perform but rarely featured. His presence was powerful, but not palatable to an industry that demanded charm before substance. Still, he kept going. He formed new bands, collaborated with major artists, and continued recording. But with each passing year, the gap between the critical respect he earned and the mainstream success he was denied became more glaring. He had the voice of a star, but not the face they wanted on magazine covers. And thus, a painful contradiction began to define his career. He was too good to ignore, yet never quite allowed to rise. The tragedy wasn't that Doug Parkinson failed, it's that he was never fully given the chance to succeed on his own terms. Doug Parkinson's early career had all the makings of a classic rise: raw talent, breakout success, and the unwavering respect of his peers. He began with the A sound, but it was the formation of Doug Parkinson and Focus that marked the turning point. Their reimagined version of Dear Prudence in 1969 didn't just resonate, it exploded. The Beatles themselves were said to be impressed by the cover, and in Australia, it became a definitive soul rock anthem. The success of Dear Prudence made Parkinson a star overnight. He was suddenly performing on Countdown, drawing packed crowds and being hailed in music magazines as a voice unlike any other in Australian music. His vocals were gritty and emotional, channeling the pain and depth of soul music through a distinctly Australian lens. His live shows were electric. Audiences said he didn't just sing, he possessed the song. But as his reputation grew, so did the tension between his undeniable talent and the limits the industry quietly placed on him. While he could outsing nearly anyone, he wasn't invited into the elite celebrity circles. Other bands, some with little vocal ability but well-groomed looks, were getting commercial endorsements, international deals, and prime TV slots. Doug was rarely the face of a campaign. He began noticing patterns. He would be brought in to elevate a project musically, but not be spotlighted in promotional material. Still, he adapted. In the early 1970s, he formed Fanny Adams, a supergroup meant to break internationally. They moved to London to chase the dream, but the reception was lukewarm. British labels didn't know how to market them. Parkinson's sound was respected, but once again, the image didn't translate. They returned to Australia, defeated. Back home, Parkinson continued to fight for relevance in a landscape that kept evolving and becoming more image-obsessed. The rise of music television meant that more and more artists were selected for their looks, not their voices. Doug's physicality, burly, bearded, intense, made him less TV-friendly. Some show producers even began requesting camera angles that avoided close-ups. Despite these pressures, Parkinson refused to compromise musically. He continued releasing albums, including No Regrets and Heartbeat to Heartbeat, which were critically praised but commercially under-supported. He joined theatrical productions like Jesus Christ Superstar and The Who's Tommy, where his booming voice found a new platform, though once again, he was rarely cast in starring roles. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Parkinson remained a workhorse of the Australian music scene. He collaborated with legends like Billy Thorpe and Renee Geyer, fronted the Southern Star Band, and maintained a loyal fan base. But the machine never backed him the way it backed others. He wasn't marketable, they said, and that label, that one word, would quietly shadow every move he made. There was no scandal, no fallout, no disgrace, just a slow fade. Not because the voice faded, it never did, but because the industry turned the volume down on a man who didn't look the part. And as the world rushed toward the glitzy 2000s, Doug Parkinson was still there, older, grayer, still singing like hell, but no longer in the spotlight. He had climbed the mountain with his voice alone. But when the world demanded a different face to match that voice, the gates quietly closed. Behind the stage lights and thunderous applause, Doug Parkinson lived a truth that he rarely voiced aloud, that no matter how masterful his singing, he was never going to be the industry's golden boy. The music world, which should have embraced the depth of his voice and the soul of his delivery, instead quietly exiled him into the realm of cult legend, admired, but never truly celebrated. It wasn't about drugs. It wasn't about scandal. Doug wasn't difficult, unreliable, or egotistical. The only mark against him was cosmetic. Industry executives and promoters whispered what no one said publicly. He didn't have the look. His physical presence, heavyset, bearded, intense, didn't match the pop packaging the era demanded. In a business obsessed with youth, slenderness, and slick appearances, Parkinson was a visual contradiction to the sound he produced. There were moments where the truth surfaced. In one interview, when asked why his recording career hadn't soared internationally, Doug simply said, "Maybe I didn't look like what they wanted to see." It was said with a half smile, as if he'd made peace with it, but there was something undeniably bitter underneath. He knew. He had always known. Producers often told him he had a radio voice, a backhanded compliment that praised his sound while disqualifying his face. He laughed about it on occasion. But the consequence was devastating. Radio played his voice, but television, where stars were truly made, rarely showed his face. Even his performances in major rock operas were framed to keep him at a distance. A voice that could shatter rooms was kept in the shadows. Fans recall how little promotion he received for shows where he carried entire acts vocally. He was the emotional engine, but the posters rarely bore his name. And yet, Doug never turned bitter publicly. There were no rants, no tell-all memoirs, no feuds, just a long, quiet endurance. He became the kind of legend people spoke about in past tense, even while he was still alive. The kind of artist whose peers would say he should have been bigger, he deserved more. Even other musicians, those who had eclipsed him in fame, admitted that his voice was superior. When Doug Parkinson passed away suddenly in 2021, tributes poured in. Headlines read, "A giant of Australian soul lost," and social media filled with memories of his performances. But many who shared his songs added the same note: "I didn't even know he was still performing." That was the heartbreak. Not that he had been forgotten entirely, but that he had slowly been hidden. In retrospect, the injustice is blinding. A man with such singular vocal power, such emotional command, should have been a mainstay in Australian music history. Instead, he became a hidden chapter. Brilliant, beloved by those who knew, but never fully embraced by the machine that makes stars. This wasn't just Doug's personal tragedy. It was a reflection of a brutal industry, one that turns down the volume on anyone who doesn't fit the visual mold. And while his voice never wavered, the silence that surrounded his image grew louder with every passing year. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe Doug Parkinson represents one of the most painful paradoxes in Australian music history. A man whose talent was undeniable, yet whose career was throttled by shallow industry standards. His voice was monumental, smoky, raw, and filled with soul, the kind that doesn't just perform a song, but inhabits it. And yet, while many lesser talents rose to pop stardom, Doug remained in the margins, applauded, but not truly elevated. It's easy in retrospect to celebrate someone's voice after they're gone. But Parkinson's story forces us to confront a harder truth. We didn't give him what he deserved while he was still here. The media paid attention when he died, but where were the documentaries, the honors, the national recognition when he was still filling clubs with that thunderous voice? His life is a mirror held up to the industry, showing how image, not talent, often decides who makes it. Doug wasn't camera-friendly, they said. He wasn't sellable. But what does that even mean when the product is music and the voice is the very thing that stirs the soul? We don't say this lightly. Doug Parkinson should have been a household name, a cultural treasure, a staple on every greatest Australian singers list. Instead, he was quietly boxed into veteran status long before he stopped creating. His contributions were real, and they were significant. But recognition came too little, too late. What's most tragic is that Doug seemed to accept it. Not because he agreed, but because he knew fighting it would only distract him from the one thing he could still control: the music. There's something heroic and heartbreaking about that kind of quiet dignity. Maybe this is the real test of greatness, when someone creates even when the world won't look. Doug Parkinson sang not for the spotlight, but because it was who he was. And that's something no image, no industry executive, no marketing trend could ever take from him. So now we ask you, have you ever heard his Dear Prudence? Have you listened to him live? Do you remember how it felt the first time you heard that voice? If not, maybe now is the time. Because sometimes, the greatest voices don't echo in arenas or fill television screens. Sometimes, they linger in smoky corners, on dusty vinyls, in memories of those lucky enough to have heard them live. Raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. Some artists shine briefly and vanish. Others burn long and slow, never blinding but always warming those who notice. Doug Parkinson was the latter, a voice not built for mass appeal, but for depth, for truth, for soul. He didn't chase the spotlight. He stood in it when invited, then stepped away with grace when it moved on without him. In the end, what remains is the voice, that husky, aching, commanding voice. A voice that could make even a Beatles song sound new. A voice that never needed styling or production tricks. It was the instrument. He didn't sing to impress. He sang to feel. And that's what made him unforgettable to those who really listened. But legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in old footage, in bootleg recordings, in faded ticket stubs from pub gigs and quiet festival nights. His legacy lives in stories told by musicians who call him the real deal. In fans who heard him once, decades ago, and never forgot. In a country that may not have crowned him properly, but now, perhaps, can finally see what it had. Doug Parkinson wasn't denied greatness. He was great. The tragedy is that we let the surface define the story. But maybe now the story can be rewritten. Maybe now we listen differently. Some stories are never told. But now, you know.